India Flight 182 was a passenger flight operating on the Montreal-London-Delhi-Bombay route that on 23 June 1985 disintegrated over the Atlantic Ocean as a result of an explosion from a bomb planted by Canadian Sikh terrorists. It was operated using a Boeing 747. The incident happened en route from Montreal to London to an altitude of 31,000 feet. The remnants of the aircraft fell into the sea approximately 190 kilometers off the coast of the island, killing all 329 people on board. The bombing of Air Indian Flight 182 is the worst terrorist attack in Canadian history, the deadliest aviation incident in the history of Air India, and was the world's deadliest act of aviation terrorism until the September 11 attacks in 2001. The mastermind behind the bombing was believed to be Inderjit Singh Riyat, a dual British-Canadian national who pleaded guilty in 2003, and Talwinder Singh Parmar, a Canadian Sikh separatist leader who was one of the key individuals associated with the militant group Bobar Kaisa, which were responsible for the bombing. The plan's execution had transnational consequences and involved citizens and governments from 5 nation-states. Although a handful of people were arrested and tried for the Air India bombing, the only person convicted was Inderjit Singh Riyat, who pleaded guilty in 2003 to manslaughter. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison for assembling the bombs that exploded on board Air India Flight 182 and at Narita. The subsequent investigation and prosecution lasted almost 20 years. This was the most expensive trial in Canadian history, costing nearly 130 million Canadian dollars. The 2 accused, Ripudaman Singh Malik and Ayub Singh Bagri, were both accused and found not guilty. The Governor General in Council in 2006 appointed the former Supreme Court Justice John C. Major to conduct a commission of inquiry. His report, which was completed and released on 17 June 2010, concluded that a cascading series of errors by the Government of Canada, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and the Canadian Security Intelligence Service had allowed the terrorist attack to take place. Japan Airlines Flight 123 was a scheduled domestic passenger flight from Tokyo to Osaka, Japan. On August 12, 1985, the Boeing 747 operating the service suffered a severe structural failure and decompression 12 minutes into the flight. After flying under minimal control for a further 32 minutes, the 747 crossed the area of Mount Takamagahara, 100 kilometers from Tokyo. The aircraft, featuring a high-density seating configuration, was carrying 424 people. The crash killed 15 crew and 505 passengers. Some of the passengers survived the initial impact but died hours later while waiting rescue. A United States Air Force navigator stationed at Yokota Air Base published an account in 1995 that stated that the US military had monitored the distress calls and prepared a search and rescue operation that was aborted at the call of Japanese authorities. A US Air Force C-130 crew was the first to spot the crash site 20 minutes after impact while it was still daylight and radioed the location to the Japanese and Yokota Air Base. A helicopter later spotted the wreck after nightfall. Poor visibility and the difficult mountainous terrain prevented it from landing at the site. The pilot reported from the air no signs of survivors. Based on this report, the helicopter personnel on the ground did not set out to the site on the night of the crash. Instead, they were dispatched to spend the night at a makeshift village, erecting tents, constructing helicopter landing ramps, and engaging in other preparations. 63 kilometers from the crash site, rescue teams set out for the site the following morning. Medical staff later found bodies with injuries, suggesting that people had survived the crash only to die from shock, exposure overnight in the mountains, or injuries that, if tended to earlier, would not have been fatal. Avianca Flight 052. Avianca Flight was a flight from Bogota, Colombia to New York City, United States, that crashed on January 25, 1990. The flight left Medellin with more than enough fuel for the journey and progressed toward John F. Kennedy International Airport. While en route, the flight was placed in 3 holding patterns due to the air traffic controllers giving ultimately untrue delay estimations. The flight became critically low on fuel. This dire situation was not recognized as an emergency by the controllers because of the failure of the pilots to use the word emergency. The flight attempted to make a landing at John Kennedy Airport, but bad weather and inadequate management of the aircraft forced it to abort and attempt a go-around. The flight ran out of fuel because it was able to make a second landing attempt. The airplane crashed about 20 miles from John F. Kennedy International Airport. Hundreds of emergency personnel responded to the crash site and helped save victims. Many of those who survived were severely injured and required months or years to physically recover. National Transportation Safety Board investigators looked at various factors that contributed to the crash. The failures of the flight crew were cited as the probable cause of the crash, but the weather, air traffic controller performances, and the Federal Aviation Administration traffic management were also cited as contributing to the events that led to the accident. This conclusion was controversial, with disagreement between investigators, passengers, and Avianca as to who was ultimately responsible. Eventually, the US government joined with Avianca and settled to pay for the damages to the victims and their families. The crash has been portrayed in a variety of media. Malaysia Airlines Flight 17. Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 was a scheduled passenger flight from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur that was shot down by Russian control forces on July 17, 2014, while flying over eastern Ukraine. All 283 passengers and 15 crew were killed. Contact with the aircraft, a Boeing 277, was lost when it was about 50 kilometers or 31 miles from the Ukraine-Russia border, and wreckage fell near Harbor Rabov in Donetsk Oblast, 40 kilometers from the border. The shootdown occurred during the war in Donbass, over territory controlled by Russian separatist forces. The responsibility for investigation was delegated to the Dutch Safety Board and the Dutch-led Joint Investigation Team, who in 2016 reported the airliner had been downed by a Buk surface-to-air missile controlled territory in Ukraine. The findings by the Dutch Safety Board and Joint Investigation Team were consistent with the earlier claims by American and German intelligence sources and claims by the Ukrainian government. On the basis of the Joint Investigation Team's conclusions, the governments of the Netherlands and Australia held Russia responsible for the deployment of the Buk installation and began pursuing legal remedies in May 2018. The Russian government denied involvement in the shooting down of the airplane, and its account of how the aircraft was shot down has varied over time. Coverage in Russian media has also differed from that in other countries. On 17 November 2022, following a trial in Absentia, 2 Russians and a Ukrainian separatist were found guilty of murdering all 298 people on board flight MH17. The Dutch court also ruled that Russia was in control of the separatist forces fighting in eastern Ukraine at the time. KLM Flight 4805 was a chartered flight for Holland International Travel Group and had arrived from Amsterdam Airport Schiphol. The KLM jet was carrying 14 crew members and 235 passengers, including 52 children. Pan Am Flight 1736 had originated at Los Angeles International Airport with an intermediate stop at New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport. This particular aircraft had operated the inaugural 747 commercial flight on January 22, 1970. On August 2, 1970, in its first year of service, it also became the first 747 to be hijacked. A bomb set off by the Canary Islands independence movement at Gran Canaria Airport had caused many flights to be diverted to Los Rodeos, including the 2 aircraft involved in the accident. The authorities temporarily closed the airport after the explosion, and all incoming flights bound for Gran Canaria had been diverted to Los Rodeos, including the 2 aircraft involved in the disaster. The Pan Am crew indicated that they would prefer to circle until landing clearance was given. They had enough fuel to safely stay in the air for 2 more hours, but they were ordered to divert to Tenerife. Los Rodeos was a regional airport that could not easily accommodate all of the traffic diverted from Gran Canaria, which included 5 large airlines. The airport had only 1 runway and 1 major taxiway running parallel to it, with 4 short taxiways connecting the two. While waiting for Gran Canaria Airport to reopen, the diverted airplanes took up so much space that they had to park on the long taxiway, making it unavailable for the purpose of taxiing. Instead, departing aircraft needed to taxi along the runway to position themselves for takeoff, a procedure known as back taxi or backtrack. The authorities reopened Gran Canaria Airport once the bomb threat had been contained. The Pan Am plane was ready to depart from Tenerife, but access to the runway was obstructed by the KLM plane and the refueling vehicle. The KLM captain had decided to fully refuel at Los Rodeos instead of Las Palmas, apparently to save time. The Pan Am aircraft was unable to maneuver around the refueling KLM in order to reach the runway for takeoff, due to a lack of safe clearance between the 2 planes, which was just 3.7 meters or 12 feet. The refueling took about 35 minutes, after which the passengers were brought back to the aircraft. The search for a missing Dutch family of 4 who had not returned to the waiting KLM plane delayed the flight even further. Robina Valansod, a tour guide, had chosen not to reboard for the flight to Las Palmas because she lived on Tenerife and thought it impractical to fly to Gran Canaria only to return to Tenerife, and was the only survivor of those who flew from Amsterdam to Tenerife. American Airlines Flight 587 was a passenger flight from John F. Kennedy International Airport to Las Americas in Santo Domingo, the capital of the Dominican Republic. On November 12, 2001, the Airbus A330B4 flying the route crashed into the neighborhood of Belle Harbor on the Rockaway Peninsula of Queens, New York City, shortly after takeoff. All 260 people aboard the plane, 251 passengers and 9 crew members were killed, as well as 5 people on the ground. It is the second deadliest aviation accident in US history, behind the crash of American Airlines Flight 191 in 1979. The location of the accident and the fact that it took place 2 months and 1 day after the September 11 attacks on the World Trade Center in nearby Manhattan initially spawned fears of another terrorist attack, but the National Transportation Safety Board attributed the disaster to the first officer overuse of rudder controls in response to wake turbulence from a preceding Japan Airlines Boeing that took off minutes before it. According to the National Transportation Safety Board, the aggressive use of the rudder controls by the first officer stressed the vertical stabilizer until it separated from the aircraft. The airliner's 2 engines also separated from the aircraft before impact due to the intense forces. The aircraft pitched downward after the stabilizer loss. As the pilot struggled to control the aircraft, it entered a flat spin. The resulting aerodynamic loads seared both engines for the aircraft, and they fell several blocks north and east of the main wreckage site, causing minor damage to a gas station and major damage to a home and a boat. The loss of engines cut power to the flight data recorder, while the cockpit voice recorder, using an emergency bus, stopped upon impact with the ground. The stall warning sounded on the cockpit voice recorder. The aircraft slammed into the ground at Newport Avenue and Beach 131 Street. Pan AM Flight 103 was a regularly Pan Am transatlantic flight from Frankfurt to Detroit. via a stopover in London and another in New York City by a clipper made of the seas, a Boeing 747 registered N739PA, shortly after 7 o'clock in the evening on 21 December 1988. While the aircraft was in flight over the Scottish town of Lockerbie, it was destroyed by a bomb that had been planted on board, killing all 243 passengers and 16 crew in what became known as the Lockerbie bombing. Large sections of the aircraft crashed in a residential street in Lockerbie, killing 11 residents with a total of 270 fatalities. It is the deadliest terrorist attack in the history of the United Kingdom. Following a 3-year joint investigation by Dumfries and Galloway Constabulary and the FBI, arrest warrants were issued for 2 Libyan nationals in November 1991. In 1999, Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi handed over the 2 men for trial at Camp Taist. After protracted negotiations and UN sanctions, in 2001, Abdel Basset al-Megrahi, a Libyan intelligence officer, was jailed for life after being found guilty of 270 counts of murder in connection with the bombing. In August 2009, he was released by the Scottish government on compassionate grounds after being diagnosed with prostate cancer. He died in May 2012 as the only person to be convicted for the attack. In 2003, Gaddafi accepted Libya's responsibility for the Lockerbie bombing and paid compensation to the families of the victims. Although he maintained that he had never given the order for the attack, acceptance of responsibility was part of a series of requirements laid out by a UN resolution for sanctions against Libya to be lifted. Libya said it had to accept responsibility due to Megrahi's status as a government employee. During the first Libyan civil war, in 2011, former Minister of Justice Mustafa Abdul Jalil claimed that the Libyan leader had personally ordered the bombing, while investigators have long believed that Megrahi did not act alone and have been reported as questioning retired Stasi agents about a possible role in the attack. Some relatives of the dead, including Lockerbie campaigner James Wire, believe the bomb was planted at Heathrow Airport and not sent via feeder flights from Malta, as per the US and UK governments. A sleeper cell belonging to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command had been operating in West Germany in the months before the Pan Am bombing. In 2020, US authorities indicted the Tunisia resident and Libyan national Abu Aguila Mohamed Massoud Khair al-Marimi, who was 37 years old at the time of the incident, for participating in the bombing. He was taken into custody in December 2022.